Inside America's Boardrooms, the informational show for board members and corporate secretaries. Brought to you with knowledge partners NASDAQ, the Center for Audit Quality, and PwC. Along with content contributors Equilar, Meridian Compensation Partners, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati, R.R. Donnelly, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, CEO of Boardroom Resources, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the show. We are filming from the NASDAQ Entrepreneurial Center, which is in San Francisco, and it is a nonprofit dedicated to providing entrepreneurs with quality resources and access to mentors and training and networking, and it's all free of charge to entrepreneurs. So we thank them for lending their studios for this. And today we are going to be talking about creating an effective CEO succession process. And joining me is a person that is might be classified as an expert in this area with all your experience. Let me introduce my guest, Sara Grootwassink Lewis, who is on the board of multiple boards. So let me introduce those companies just so that we have a good background. First of all, you serve on the PS Business Parks. You're chairman of the Audit Committee and on the Nominating Corporate Governance Committee and Presiding Director. You also serve on Plum Creek Timber and on the Audit and Compensation Committees. You also serve on Sun Life Financial, where you're on the Management Resources and the Governance Nominating and Investment Committee. And you serve on Adamas Pharmaceuticals, where you're on the Audit and the Nominating and Corporate Governance Committee. In addition to that, you're CEO of Lewis Corporate Advisors, a capital markets firm. So Sara, somebody would consider that a pretty full agenda.
Yes.
But you're on the nominating and governance committees of a lot that you serve on. So,
Right.
so typically, it's not always the case.
Right.
Sometimes it's in the comp committee, but CEO succession is typically looked at from the nominating governance part or the compensation. So the rewarding and the recruitment, the rewarding and the retention of the CEO is one of what I call the core responsibilities of the board. The other responsibilities I say are risk management and strategic planning issues. Those are the three, to me, foundational responsibilities. But many people argue that the most important function of the board is to make sure that you have the right CEO in place. Would you agree with that?
I absolutely agree. I mean, it's as part of our duty to create and sustain shareholder value, we absolutely have to ensure that there's continuity at the top. And the tone at the top is everything. The success of the company is driven by the CEO. And so if you don't have the right CEO in the chair, nothing else really matters. And I think we've all read about or heard about failed CEO successions and the fallout that occurs from that, whether it's lost shareholder value, a damaged reputation, stalled initiatives, or even, I think the hardest part is the breakdown in employee morale. And I think that I can assure you that a failed CEO succession is very draining and disruptive to employees. And so it's vitally important that boards have a very thoughtful, disciplined approach to CEO succession because it can make a huge difference for the company.
And it is very clear. The public can tell right away whether a board is organized in that fashion or they aren't organized.
Well, it's almost sometimes reflective of how you manage the business overall.
So most directors, when they join a board, the CEO is already on board, okay? Yes, some go through the experience of there's a CEO opening or a retirement or somebody has been terminated, so you have that. But most likely when you join a board, there's a CEO sitting there in place. So your responsibility becomes CEO succession. So we're going to take a look at making sure that program is in place. Now, interestingly enough, in the studies that I've been involved with over the years, CEO succession is one of the things that the directors themselves have said that they are least effective at doing, okay? So what should a company be doing, to have it in place? Who owns that task? And then why are the directors themselves saying that they are somewhat dysfunctional in performing this task?
So, I have a lot of experience in CEO succession from several different perspectives, from being the chief financial officer of a public company, going through the CEO selection process, being a member of several boards that have ongoing succession planning processes that are a regular part of the board agenda. And then I also have been the chairman of the Nominating Corporate Governance Committee for a CEO selection. So I have those board and executive experiences. I also understand it from a CEO's perspective. I've had several friends who have turned over the reins of being CEO, and even my husband, who retired after 17 years as CEO at an S&P 500 company. And so I've seen a broad range of outcomes from, I would say, total failure to complete success and almost everything in between. But when you talk about the reticence that board members and CEOs might have in talking about CEO succession, I think that happens when it hasn't become part of a regular, ongoing leadership development program within the company. Ideally, you have a leadership development program that goes down not only from the CEO but to the executive team and a layer below that. And when you have an ongoing conversation that's a board agenda item, it takes away a lot of the emotion around it because it's just a normal course of business. Now, there are other instances where perhaps the board dynamic isn't quite right, and so that can cause issues in discussing the CEO succession. But I think all CEOs understand that it's vitally important to the company to have a strong succession plan. And if the board dynamic is right, they're more than willing to discuss it.
It would come under the category of a sensitive topic. And I understand how board members sometimes don't want to press the issue, and I understand how CEOs may not step up real quickly. But a CEO can play a huge role in making that comfortable if, again, your suggestion is the best case where it's part of a structured program.
Right.
But in the happenstance that that's not the case,
right,
a CEO can certainly make this a much easier process for the board if they understand the importance of making sure that that's in place. If for no other reason than something happens to them short term.
Right. Well, absolutely. And I'll talk about that in a second. But I think that you have to come back to your core mission as a board member and as a CEO, and that's the creation and preservation of shareholder value. And so it's incumbent upon you to have the conversation. It may be uncomfortable. It may be not the most timely thing, depending on what's going on with the company, but you have to, because it's so important to the continuity of the company and preserving shareholder value. And so I think, again, it goes back to the dynamic in the boardroom. If you don't already have a leadership development program in place, it's something that you should work on for the future, because it's important to build a management team up who can provide internal candidates for the CEO successor. And it's just really important for the continuity of the company in general. And so you have to have the conversation, as difficult as it may be.
So in addition to the leadership program, what are other steps that sort of a board can take to make sure that they have this covered, in their organization? Obviously that's the biggest, but what other steps would you sort of recommend to make sure that they had a viable CEO succession program?
Well, if you have that leadership development program going on for a number of years, you're much more likely to be able to develop and identify an internal candidate. And that's, usually the first choice for boards and outgoing CEOs, is to have an internal candidate. I think that the other things that you can do is to make sure that the board gets to know each of those internal candidates, both inside the boardroom and outside the boardroom. You often learn a lot about a person outside of the boardroom. Golf can be very interesting. And then I think you need to make sure that there's a development plan that's in place for each of these internal candidates to make sure that they're, getting exposure to whatever areas they might have gaps in. And then I think that, it's important to make sure that as you get closer to a succession actually occurring, I think it's very important that the board and the CEO and the committees that work on it all have an understanding of what role they will share in this process. And then again, as you get closer, you might want to look at external candidates as well as your internal candidates, but I think it's really important that you make sure it's a very transparent process with your internal candidates and that they believe it's fair. Otherwise, you risk losing those people that are maybe your best candidates by not having a strong communication with them. And then I think finally, once you've actually made the decision and you've announced who the CEO will be, you have to make sure as a board that you give that CEO the room to succeed. Many times a board is so concerned that they've made the right choice that they hold on too tight and they won't give that CEO the room he or she needs to maneuver and get things done. And so as a board, you need to make sure they have the right resources to succeed, whether it's the executive team, constructive, positive feedback from the board, and most importantly, the authority to make the changes that the new CEO deems necessary for success.
Well, Sara Lewis, there's no question that it is one of the most important functions. Mm-hmm. And I hope that we'll be able to sit here someday in the future and say that there is no longer the concern on the director's part that they have mastered this task, because it is so important. But I wanted to thank you for giving your advice and your time here on the show.
Thank you.
And that will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We will be back again next week when we take a look at another critical topic that'll help you be a better board member and committee member. So we'll see you then.
Join us again next week for Inside America's Boardrooms. Brought to you with Knowledge Partners, NASDAQ, the Center for Audit Quality, and PwC. Along with content contributors Equilar, Meridian Compensation Partners, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati, R.R. Donnelly, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.